The Canadians, the Germans said, fought like madmen. They came in darkness. They advanced in driving rain. They stepped over their own wounded and kept moving. These were not the rantings of some propaganda official trying to terrify civilians, nor the panicked exaggerations of a frightened conscript. They came from cool, deliberate situation reports written by experienced German officers at the height of the Second World War. For the Wehrmacht, and especially for the fanatical formations of the Waffen SS, the Western Front was already a landscape of overwhelming Allied firepower. Yet even in that nightmare, a hierarchy of fear emerged. When a German soldier looked out over the burnt fields of Normandy or the shattered streets of an Italian hill town, he saw three distinct enemies. He saw the Americans and dreaded what their industry could unleash. Columns of tanks that never seemed to end, skies thick with aircraft, and a bottomless well of shells that could erase entire coordinates from the map. He saw the British and grudgingly admired their stubbornness, their rigid discipline, and the weight of an empire that refused to collapse after 5 years of total war. But when his binoculars settled on the men with maple leaf patches, something else stirred. Fear of Canadian infantry was not fear of machines, nor fear of sheer numbers. It was fear of the men themselves. That raised one of the most unsettling questions of the conflict. Why? Why did the German High Command, architects of Blitzkrieg and conquerors of Europe, single out a relatively small volunteer army from a distant dominion as their most dangerous infantry opponent? Why did confidential assessments within SS headquarters sometimes rate Canadian units as more ferocious than their American or British counterparts? The answer does not lie on the big arrows of staff maps in Eisenhower's or Montgomery's headquarters. It lies in the flooded ditches of the Scheldt, where men fought waist-deep in black water. It lies in the pulverized houses of Ortona, where civilized rules of engagement dissolved into knife thrusts and grenade blasts. And it lies in a reputation that Canadians did not simply inherit from their fathers at Vimy Ridge, but reforged with a brutality that unsettled even Allied observers. To understand the anomaly, we have to strip away the modern image of Canada. Today, the country is often imagined as a land of peacekeepers, defined by politeness, compromise, and diplomacy. But between 1939 and 1945, Canada was something very different. It was a nation in the process of hardening itself in fire. The United States brought the crushing weight of mass production into the war. It fielded a huge army and replaced its losses with waves of new conscripts, many of whom were rushed into combat with only the basics. Britain, exhausted from standing alone for years, rotated veteran formations over and over until they were worn down to the bone. Canada chose another path. The Canadian Army in Europe was small on paper, 5 infantry divisions and 2 armor brigades. But what it lacked in size, it concentrated into frightening efficiency. While American units were constantly rotated and British formations carried the fatigue of campaigns from North Africa to Italy, many Canadian units spent long years in Britain waiting to be unleashed. They drilled in the rain, marched across moorland, rehearsed landings until their legs shook. Their doctrine evolved toward shock infantry, aggression over hesitation, initiative over rigid procedure, violent forward momentum over cautious pause. By the time they finally crossed the channel toward Fortress Europe, the average Canadian rifleman was not simply a volunteer. He was a tightly wound spring of aggression. The Germans quickly understood that these were not men who fought solely for ground on a map. They fought with a personal intensity that was unnerving. Where an American company might halt and summon an airstrike to pulverize a machine gun nest, and a British battalion might methodically outflank the position, German defenders found Canadian units oddly willing to close the range, rush head-on, and wrest the position away under conditions that any sane commander would call impossible. Captured documents from the 71st Infantry Division in Italy described a visible shift in morale the moment German troops realized they were facing Canadier. One report summed it up with brutal simplicity. The Americans kill you with their equipment. The British kill you with their perseverance. The Canadians kill you because they choose to. This is not just a list of battles. It is an investigation into why the Wehrmacht, arguably the most professional army of the 20th century, recoiled from the sight of that maple leaf emblem. We will walk through the swamp of death in the Scheldt, the little Stalingrad of Ortona, and the killing grounds of Normandy to uncover a ruthless truth history often softens. The Canadians became the Allies' shock troops, sent in when a task was too costly, too ugly, or too difficult for anyone else. To understand the depth of German anxiety, We have to look past newsreels and speeches and into the smudged carbon copies of frontline messages. It is in those hurried, typewritten reports sent back to Corps headquarters that the real image of the Canadian soldier appears. Not a gallant knight, but a predator. German doctrine prized timing, precision, and the honed tactics of their own stormtroopers. They believed they understood the rhythm of enemy armies. The British, for instance, had a recognizable cadence. They would seize an objective, consolidate, brew their tea, and wait for the logistics tail to catch up. That pause, so culturally familiar, gave German commanders time to prepare counterblows. The Canadians refused to respect that rhythm. An intelligence summary from a panzer division in Italy noted a troubling pattern. The Canadians attack aggressively and without compassion, it read. They do not observe the natural pauses in battle. This was the first pillar of German fear, relentless pursuit. For most armies, when the sun went down, the battlefield settled into uneasy stillness. Night attacks were considered risky, confusing, and hard to coordinate. Many Allied officers preferred to dig in and wait for first light. Canadian units instead claimed the dark as their own. They became masters of the night raid. German sentries discovered that darkness brought no safety. In fact, that was when the wild men were most likely to come. A Fallschirmjäger captured near Ortona confessed that their company could never fully relax when Canadians held the opposite line. They move like ghosts and strike with knives, he said. Then there was the weather. Rain and mud were supposed to be the great levelers, slowing offensives and forcing stalemate. Reports from the Scheldt estuary, however, where the fighting played out in waist-deep water and fields turned to liquid clay, show a Wehrmacht struggling to understand what they were seeing. They attack in weather in which no one should fight, one officer wrote. Where other armies halted to wait for dry skies and air support, Canadian battalions pushed forward through lashing rain and sucking mud. To a German soldier shivering in his foxhole, watching enemy figures emerge out of a freezing storm felt like witnessing something unnatural. It suggested there was no refuge left, not behind a ridge, not across a river, not even behind the elements. And yet Canadian fear factor was not built on mindless fury alone. If they were feral in close quarters, at range they could be calculating technicians. This formed the second pillar, artillery. The German army respected American artillery for its volume, but it feared Canadian artillery for its accuracy. Drawing on the painful lessons learned by the Canadian Corps in the First World War, where they had refined counter-battery fire at places like Vimy Ridge, the gunners of 1939 to 45 became arguably some of the most precise in the Allied camp. German veterans later compared their fire control to that of Soviet batteries on the Eastern Front, and in Wehrmacht circles that was the highest kind of fearful praise. Canadian guns did not simply fire, they choreographed destruction. Their creeping barges rolled forward with terrifying discipline, a wall of explosions walking just ahead of advancing infantry. For the German in his trench, that meant there was no window of safety, no breathing space between the last shell and the first bayonet. The moment the thunder ended, Canadians were already in the wire. One report from the Rhineland warned German troops in blunt terms, if the shelling ceases, do not look up. They are already upon you. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the Canadian tendency not to pull back once committed. In the fluid warfare of 1944, tactical withdrawals were standard. Units hit too hard were expected to fall back and reform. German counterattacks, those sharp, sudden counterstrokes, counted on that reflex. Again and again, though, counterattacks slammed into Canadian positions and broke apart. On Verrières Ridge in Normandy, facing elements of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, Canadian brigades absorbed blows that would have shattered less experienced formations. They bent, they bled, but they did not yield the ground. To German officers who prided themselves on military logic, this refusal to do this sensible thing was maddening. It turned local engagements into grinding, attritional fights they could no longer afford. As the war dragged on, a darker layer built up around that reputation, one that went beyond doctrine or courage. A cycle of revenge grew between Canadian units and the Waffen-SS. It was no longer just lines on a map. It became personal. In the hedgerows of Normandy, when word spread that Canadian prisoners were being executed by SS formations, something hardened. Take no prisoners was no longer just a phrase muttered in mess tents. It became a practice at the sharp end. German troops realized they were facing an enemy drawing on a deep, cold reservoir of anger. They were not fighting reluctant draftees. They were fighting men who had crossed an ocean and now carried a score to settle. One German officer, briefing replacements, put it this way: beware the Americans. They have the tanks. Fear the Canadians. They have the hatred. Yet reputation was only the overture. The full composition of German fear was written in 3 brutal campaigns: a flooded estuary, a medieval town turned slaughterhouse, and a fatal strip of sand. The first crucible was Ortona, Italy, in December 1943. To the paratroopers of the German 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, Ortona was a fortress. Medieval alleys, stone houses with thick walls, and streets piled high with debris, perfect for snipers and ambushes. The British 8th Army had stalled. American forces were engaged elsewhere. It fell to the Canadians to crack the town. What followed was so savage that journalists called it Little Stalingrad on the Adriatic. Faced with streets swept by machine gun fire, Canadian infantry reinvented the way they fought in cities. Rather than stepping into the open, they blasted holes through adjoining walls, moving from building to building under cover. Mouse-holing, they called it. A charge went off. A doorway became a jagged gap. Grenades and bursts of submachine gun fire went through first, and then men followed into the dust for hand-to-hand fighting. They advanced through Ortona without touching the cobblestones. German defenders were stunned. They expected an enemy to come down the roads. Instead, they faced one that chewed through their houses like termites in stone and concrete. The close-quarters fighting, done with pistols, knives, rifle butts, and bare hands, shook even elite paratroopers. They were not being overrun by sheer numbers, but by a kind of street-level ferocity they had rarely seen. If Ortona was a nightmare of stone, the Scheldt estuary in late 1944 was a nightmare of mud. Strategically, it was one of Canada's most important contributions to the war. The port of Antwerp was crucial to Allied logistics, but its approaches lay under German guns placed along flooded lowlands and reclaimed polders. The terrain was a planner's horror: flat, open, inundated, and bitterly cold. Armored divisions bogged down or simply could not deploy. American units were focused on driving toward the Rhine. The task fell once more to the 1st Canadian Army. German commanders called the area the Swamp of Death. They believed the land itself would do most of the killing for them. No sane army, they thought, would advance across open dikes under machine gun fire, slog through waist-deep icy water, and keep going. The Canadians came anyway. They attacked along causeways swept by overlapping fields of fire, pushed through black water that turned scarlet, and used amphibious vehicles where they could, but more often relied on raw human endurance. To German defenders watching through binoculars, the sight of figures slowly advancing through freezing floodwater, explosions all around them, sometimes with wounded men in tow, created a sense of inevitability. It ate away at their will to stand and fight. A captured major later remarked that the American soldier fought well with dry socks and a hot meal, but the Canadians seemed to treat misery as a natural state. By clearing the Scheldt, Canadians did more than open a port. They sent a message. There is no landscape on Earth, stone, mud, or water, where they could not kill. Then there was Normandy. D-Day is often narrated through the bloodbath at Omaha Beach. Yet on Juno, where the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division landed, the odds were no kinder. They faced seawalls, bunkers, and a rising tide that scattered and delayed landing craft. When their ramps dropped, they walked into interlocking arcs of fire. By the end of that longest day, however, Canadian troops had driven farther inland than any other Allied force. The true forging of their sinister reputation came in the weeks that followed. In the bocage around Cannes, they ran head-on into the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, a formation of fanatical teenage volunteers led by hardened Eastern Front veterans. The fighting was primitive and intimate, fueled by a hatred that fed on itself. When the SS murdered Canadian prisoners near the Abbaye d'Ardenne, news of it raced through Canadian lines. Something broke. The already harsh war turned feral. The Canadians began to answer atrocity with their own mercilessness. Among SS units, the Canadians ceased to be seen as just another Allied infantry. They became executioners. In the cauldron battles around Cannes and in the closing of the Falaise Pocket, Canadian divisions often served as the anvil against which retreating German forces were smashed. The fear they inspired grew so intense that German units would sometimes maneuver, if they could, to surrender to British or American units rather than risk falling into Canadian hands. From Ortona's rubble to the slime of the Scheldt and the hedgerows of Normandy, one message came through. The Canadians were not just present at the end of the war. They helped end it, yard by bloody yard. To understand their unique place in German eyes, we have to hold them up alongside their closest allies. The invasion of Western Europe was a coalition strike, three prongs of a trident driving into the Reich. But to German officers watching from their bunkers, those three prongs felt very different when they pierced the line. Consider first the Americans. By 1944, the U.S. Army was a force of nature. To German planners, American power represented the crushing inevitability of industrial war. Their supply network seemed endless. If a Tiger tank knocked out 5 Shermans, 10 more appeared on the horizon the next day. The German fear of Americans was a fear of being smothered. In internal memoranda, however, German assessments of American infantry were often mixed. Brave, certainly, but frequently green. The explosive growth of the U.S. Army meant many units entered combat with little experience. They leaned heavily on overwhelming firepower to solve tactical problems. Faced with a machine gun nest, an American commander might call in bombers or a devastating artillery strike to erase the entire area. Effective, yes, but distant. It lacked the close-in, personal cruelty that scars a man's sleep. The German soldier feared the American machine more than the man behind the trigger. The British were another matter. They had been fighting since 1939, surviving Dunkirk, the Blitz, and the Desert campaigns. By Normandy, the British Army was disciplined, technically skilled, and stubborn in defense. But it was also drained. After years of constant fighting, Britain was running low on manpower. That reality seeped into tactics. Field Marshal Montgomery favored bite and hold, operations designed to limit casualties. British forces would seize an objective, dig in, and refuse to overextend. Germans respected the British Tommy's tenacity, but did not fear him for unpredictability. The British were a known quantity, steady, dangerous, but cautious. And then there were the Canadians. They occupied a disturbing middle ground. Like the British, they were versed in Commonwealth doctrine and could coordinate artillery and armor with sophistication. Unlike the British, they were not exhausted. They were fresh volunteers who had trained for years for this one chance to fight. Like Americans, they possessed an aggressive, improvisational streak, a frontier mentality that prized initiative. Unlike many Americans, they were not green. The core of their infantry consisted of long-serving volunteers hardened on Scottish training grounds and live-fire exercises before they ever stepped on a French soil. The result was a type of soldier the Germans struggled to categorize, and thus struggled to counter. Canadians fought with the technical precision of the British, but attacked with the fury of a newly committed American unit. General Eberhard Kinzel, assessing Allied armies, noted that while British troops would halt to reorganize, Canadians tended simply to keep going. They practiced deep battle. When they broke through, they did not sit on their gains. They drove into rear areas, hit supply columns, and disrupted command posts. They were shock troops in the true sense, a hammer to be used at the point of decision. There was also a political edge behind their ferocity. Canadian commanders like Guy Simons were not just contesting fields and villages. They were fighting for their country's place in the post-war world. Canada was a relatively small nation trying to prove its weight. It demanded difficult, high-prestige assignments to show what it could do. That ambition filtered downward. Canadian infantry did not see themselves as just another imperial contingent. They were Canadians, and they wanted that to mean something. That national pride translated into unit cohesion that was remarkably hard to break. The German on the receiving end could feel the difference without ever reading a report. Facing Americans meant weathering a rain of steel. Facing British formations meant a grinding, deliberate push. Facing Canadians meant you were likely to be hit at night, in foul weather, by men who used bayonets with practiced ease and seemed to take a grim satisfaction in close combat. One captured officer from the 12th SS Panzer Division reportedly remarked, "When we fought Canadians, the fighting was fiercer, the shelling closer, and mercy absent." The Canadians were not superhuman. They paid terribly for their reputation. During the Normandy campaign, Canadian infantry units suffered some of the highest casualty rates among Allied forces. But it was precisely this willingness to endure losses, to keep going where others would pull back, that unsettled the enemy. The Germans considered themselves students of war. They valued logic, maneuver, and self-preservation. In Americans, they saw a glimpse of war's future, machines and logistics ruling the field. In British troops, they saw a mirror of their own past, empire, discipline, and method. In Canadians, they saw something older, more primitive. They saw an enemy who fought not for empire or vast strategy, but for the patch of ground directly ahead of his boots. The Canadian infantryman became the bogeyman of the Western Front because he broke the unspoken contract of modern warfare. He attacked when it made no sense. He held when a calculated retreat would have been justified. He carried anger like another piece of equipment. From sniper-ridden ruins in Ortona to the submerged dikes of the Scheldt, Canadians did the jobs no one else wanted. They were the British Empire's sledgehammer, brought out of the case when the normal tools failed. The cost of being that hammer was written in the place names that still haunt regimental colors. Dieppe, Ortona, Verrières Ridge, the Scheldt, the Hochwald. They were not just victories. They were graveyards. In those graveyards, a new national identity took shape. Canada did not leave the Second World War as merely a quiet dominion. It emerged as a country that had paid in blood for a seat at the table, not because of its population, but because of its sacrifice. For the German soldier hunched in a frozen foxhole in early 1945, watching khaki-clad figures advance out of the northern haze, debates about geopolitics meant nothing. All that mattered was the dread, a dread that, in his mind, belonged to Canada alone. Perhaps the most chilling summary of the German experience did not appear decades later in a historian's book, but in the immediate, terrified comment of a weary officer from the 346th Infantry Division. As his positions collapsed and his men surrendered to the wild men from the north, he dictated a final note that captured their sense of futility against this enemy. When American troops attacked, he wrote, they called for more guns. When British troops attacked, they called for more reserves. But when the Canadians appeared on the line, they knew the fight was already lost.